5 threes. 19 points. All in one quarter. That is what Justine Pissott did in her Las Vegas Aces debut, playing alongside Aya Wilson. And it is a WNBA record for a debut game. But here is what makes this absolutely infuriating. The Indiana Fever had her first. She was the perfect teammate next to Caitlin Clark. They drafted her. They watched her torch the New York Liberty in preseason. And then they let her walk, for nothing, because they said she wasn't ready. Well, she just proved that was a complete lie. In front of the entire league. And Caitlin Clark had to watch it happen from Indiana. Now Pissott is breaking her silence, and she is not holding back against the Fever front office. What should Indiana Fever ownership do to the front office for making such a big fumble? Let me know down in the comments below. But before that, let's break this down, piece by piece. Welcome to Hoops Uncovered, where we uncover the biggest stories, legends, and controversies in basketball. Let's dive in. Let's start with what actually happened on that court in Las Vegas. The scoreboard says Phoenix vs. Las Vegas. July 11th. Justine Pissott checks in wearing an Aces jersey for the very first time in her career. No warm-up story. No slow build. No let's ease her in. She catches the ball in the corner, squares up, and buries a three. Then she does it again. And again. Before Phoenix even knows what's happening, Pissott has drilled shot after shot from deep, stacking threes in a stretch that no player has ever put together in a debut game in WNBA history. By the final buzzer, the stat line reads, 5 3-pointers. 19 points. And get this, one quarter alone accounts for most of that scoring. Enough to set the record for most points in a quarter during a WNBA debut. 19 points off the bench. In your first game. Against a real playoff-caliber Phoenix defense. That is not a fluke shooting night. That is a player who knows exactly what she is, and finally got the green light to prove it. Now let's rewind. Because this story didn't start in Las Vegas. It started in Indiana. Before this game, Stephanie White stood in front of reporters and explained why a 6'4" shooter with a 7-foot wingspan wasn't good enough for a Rio roster spot. The explanation always circled back to the same word, readiness. Not her jumper. Not her feel for the game. Not her defense. Just this vague, empty idea that she wasn't ready to play WNBA minutes. Think about that for a second. Indiana drafted a forward built exactly like the stretch bigs every team in this league is hunting for. And instead of developing her in real games, they parked her on a development contract and in street clothes for the entire season. That's not development. That's burying a player you don't want to admit you misjudged. Let me explain what a development contract actually means in the WNBA. It is not like a normal roster spot. It means you practice with the team. You might dress for a handful of games. But you do not count against the real roster. And the team is not committing to you long term. It is basically the front office telling you, quietly, that they don't see you in the rotation right now. And maybe not later either. So when Stephanie White talks about readiness, what she's really describing is a decision that was made in the front office long before training camp even ended. And that decision wasn't just about defense. It was about whether Indiana wanted to build around a shooter who changes the geometry of the floor, or stick with what they already had. We all know which one they chose. Because here's what actually happened with the roster. The Fever kept Grace Van Sloten and Damiris Dantas on the standard roster. Both bigs who play a similar style to what Indiana already has too much of. Damiris Dantas barely saw the floor most nights. Some games, not at all. And yet she kept her spot while Pissott sat on a development deal watching from the sideline. Grace Van Sloten? Single-digit minutes. A bench piece getting almost no playing time. Meanwhile, Pissott, a 6'4" shooter who lit up the New York Liberty in the preseason, sat on a non-guaranteed deal. Stephanie White called Dantas and Van Sloten great culture players. Great teammates. Said they'd be ready when their number is called. But here's the problem, culture doesn't space the floor. Culture doesn't pull defenders away from Caitlin Clark. Culture doesn't fix Indiana's biggest offensive weakness. If the read on Pissott is that she wasn't ready, then somebody needs to explain how a bench piece getting single-digit minutes a night was more ready than a 6'4" shooter who torched a playoff team in preseason. That math does not add up. That preseason game against the New York Liberty is worth remembering. Because it's the one moment the Fever couldn't hide what she brought to the floor. Pissott went out there and did exactly what her Vanderbilt tapes said she'd do. She knocked down threes from WNBA range. She contested shots. She used her 7-foot wingspan to bother smaller forwards. That game wasn't a fluke. That was a 6'4" shooter with legit length doing exactly what she'd always done, just on a bigger stage against a real WNBA roster. 16 points on the night. And she looked like she belonged. Vanderbilt's coaching staff talked about her mechanics being some of the cleanest in her entire draft class. A repeatable stroke with a quick release that doesn't break down under pressure. 42.2%. That's what Justine Pissott shot from 3 at Vanderbilt. And for a 6'4" forward, that number isn't just good, it's rare. Most players her size in college ball are down in the post banging for rebounds. Not stepping beyond the arc and knocking down shots at a clip that would make some guards jealous. So the question isn't whether she could shoot. The question is why a shooting profile like that got buried on a bench in Indiana. Now let's talk about her physical tools, because this is what makes the Fever's decision even more ridiculous. Picture this for a second. You've got a forward standing 6'4", stretching defenses out to the three-point line, and still long enough to switch onto smaller, quicker players without getting torched. That is not a common combination. Most shooters that size in college don't have the length to hang on defense. And most long defenders don't have a jumper this clean. Pissott had both. And it showed up on film long before she ever put on a Fever jersey. Her wingspan measures right around 7 feet. That sounds almost unfair for someone with her shooting touch. That length changes everything defensively because it lets her contest shots without leaving her feet early. And it lets her stay in front of forwards who are supposed to be quicker than her. A normal 6'4" defender might get beat off the dribble by a shifty 4. Pissott's reach closes that gap before the quicker player even gets there. That's exactly why smaller forwards struggled to create separation against her at Vanderbilt. Versatility beats speed. And she had both. This roster call doesn't sit only on Stephanie White's shoulders either. General Manager Amber Cox and Team President Kelly Krauskopf run that front office. And any decision about who gets a standard contract versus a development deal runs through their desks before it ever reaches the bench. So when the not ready explanation gets repeated in press conferences, that's not just coach speak from White. That's the entire organization signing off on burying a rookie who fit exactly what their offense was missing. And it's worth sitting with the irony here. The Fever had a bench player in Dantas logging minimum minutes on a guaranteed roster spot, while the player who actually addressed their spacing problem sat on an unguaranteed deal because the front office said she wasn't ready. That's not roster management. That's negligence. Indiana had a real choice in front of them. They could have cut ties with a bench big who wasn't playing anyway. They could have locked Pissott into a real roster spot where she belonged. Instead, they let her sit. Let her here not ready all season. And let another team scoop her up. For free. Now let's talk about why this matters for Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever. Watch Caitlin Clark drive into the paint on any given night this season. She gets to the rim, or close to it, and there's nobody spacing the floor from the forward spot to make the defense pay for helping off. The help defender just sits there. Comfortable. Because the player he left behind isn't a threat from outside anyway. So instead of a driving lane staying open, it collapses the second Clark makes her move. She's driving into a wall of bodies that has no reason to respect anything beyond 15 feet. Now look at Indiana's front court rotation this year. Aaliyah Boston, Nalissa Smith, Monique Billings, Grace Van Sluten, and Damaris Dantas. Every single one of them is a traditional post player. Somebody who scores around the rim, or in the short mid-range. And not one of them is a real threat from 3. That's 5 bigs who all do roughly the same job. Which means opposing defenses know exactly what's coming every time Indiana runs a set. They sit in the paint. They help early. They double whoever has the ball down low. Because there's no reason to respect the perimeter from that position. That kind of front court turns Aaliyah Boston's job into a nightmare. Instead of getting the ball on the block with room to work, she catches it already surrounded. A second defender arriving before she even squares up. Clark drives into the same wall of bodies for the same reason. No shooter dragging a defender away from the rim. So the paint stays packed no matter what Indiana tries to run. Think about shooting gravity for a second, because this is the real concept here. When a forward can actually knock down threes, her defender has to stay attached out past the arc. That physically pulls that body away from the paint. That's one less defender available to help. One less body clogging the driving lane. One less arm reaching in to strip Boston on a post move. A shooter with range at the 4 doesn't just add points, she changes where every defender on the floor has to stand. Now picture Pissott in that same Indiana lineup. A defender cannot leave her alone above the break because she's shooting over 40% from 3, and she just proved it travels to the pro line in her Aces debut. That defender has to respect the arc. That drags him away from the rim. That means Boston gets a cleaner look on the block. And Clark gets an actual driving lane instead of a crowd. That's shooting gravity doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Pulling defenders away from where Indiana needs them gone. This wasn't a small roster upgrade the Fever passed on. Pissott was the direct answer to Indiana's biggest structural problem all season. A floor-spacing 4 who could have changed how defenses guard Boston and Clark on every single possession. And she didn't get the chance to prove any of that in Indiana. She had to leave the state to show the whole league what the Fever refused to use. Now let's talk about what happened in Las Vegas, because Becky Hammon didn't hesitate. Hammon watched the tape, saw the shooter, and immediately put Pissott in the rotation. No easing her in. No baby steps. No development talk. Just trust from game 1. Here's what Hammon said afterward, and listen to these words carefully. I just met her. What I will say is we watched a lot of tape on her at Vanderbilt. Obviously, you guys know I love shooters, and she can shoot that thing. So that's why we went out and got her. She made some nice basketball reads as well, not just the shooting. We're really excited to have her with our group. Quite a debut for a rookie coming in and getting 19 in 10 minutes. That is the opposite of a development contract. That is a head coach looking at a 6'4" shooter and deciding immediately she belongs in the rotation on a championship roster. Not stashed on the bench hoping she figures it out. And Aya Wilson's reaction matters just as much. Wilson doesn't hand out compliments to just anybody. But she welcomed Pissott like she'd been there all along. Playing next to a reigning MVP, and reacting the way she did, tells you everything about how fast Pissott fit into a locker room that's used to winning titles. It's one thing to look good against bad defenses. It's another thing to slide into a championship rotation next to the best player in the league, and look like you belong there immediately. Now let's hear from Pissott herself. Because her post-game comments landed just as hard. She didn't need to call out Indiana by name. She just said this. Everyone kept telling me to shoot the ball when you go in, play with confidence. Coach Becky was just like, yeah, go in there and do what you do. And I feel like when she told me that, I kind of just like, okay. And then I just played my game. Simple. Honest. And absolutely devastating for the Indiana Fever front office. Because that's all they ever asked her to do, and she did it. They just didn't want to see it. The sense of a player who's been sitting on what she could do for an entire season, and finally got to let it out on the floor. She didn't need a speech. She didn't need to call anyone out. The stat sheet did that for her. So here we are. Strip away everything else, and you're left with one plain fact. Indiana had a 6'4" shooter built to fix their exact weakness, and they let her walk to Las Vegas for nothing. Zero return. Zero compensation. Just gone to a division rival who immediately made her a champion's teammate. This fits a pattern now. Decisions in that front office keep working against Clark instead of for her. Game after game. Roster move after roster move. Clark's prime won't wait forever. Fans want real spacing. Real shooting. Real support around her, now. So I'll ask you again, what should Indiana Fever ownership do to the front office for making such a big fumble? Let me know down in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on all notifications, because we're bringing you all the action and top stories. Click the video on the screen right now, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.